Okay, so thank you for coming. Thank you, Katherine Blouin. I'm Dr. Abes Zawash, Director of Studies at the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology. I'm a philologist and an Arabist editing medieval text, and a historian as well, particularly interested in the history of warfare. As a historian, I used to work according to the method commonly called the longue durée in French, words referring to the French annal school approach to the study of history. And as a historian as well, I'm especially interested in the debate between objectivity and subjectivity in history, or more simply, the role and the responsibilities of the historian. As you know, so often it's said that historians' central ethical responsibility is that they ought to tell the objective truth. Therefore, it's a pleasure for me, for us, for Frédéric Lagrange, who is the director of the CEDEJ, and to welcome and me Dr. Katherine Blouin, who accepted to give this lecture organized by the CEDEJ and the IFAO. She's a professor of history and classics at the University of Toronto. She specialized in socio-economic and environmental history, with a focus on ancient and particularly Roman Egypt, as well on the ethics and decolonial entailments of antiquity-related fields. She has recently published several books, including the Nile Delta, Histories from Antiquity to the Modern Period, and she co-edited the Routledge Handbooks of Classics, Colonialism and Post-Colonial Theory. She's also the co-founder and editor of the platform Everyday Orientalism. Tonight, she will talk about the responsibility of the historian during times of crisis, a question that, in my opinion, is all the more crucial as the historian's voice is challenged by that of the essayists and polemicists, who actually currently are dominating the mediatic and intellectual field, as Bourdieu would have said. So it's up to you. Thank you, Katherine, for coming and for giving us this lecture.
Good evening, everyone. Is the sound okay? Yeah? Okay. First of all, thank you all for showing up tonight, and a special merci to Frédéric Lagrange and Abes for welcoming me here. I hope you will find this talk interesting, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards, but we'll just go through the talk first. Okay, so it goes like this. I'll start with a quote. It is tempting to identify with resistance and to say, that is what I would have done. Alas, we are far more likely to act in parallel situations, like the Vichy majority. Indeed, it may be the German occupiers, rather than the Vichy majority, whom Americans, as residents of the most powerful state on earth, should scrutinize most unblinkingly. The deeds of occupier and occupied alike suggest that there come cruel times when, to save a nation's deepest values, one must disobey the state. France after 1940 was one of those times. These words, which conclude Robert O. Paxton's seminal 1972 Vichy France, Old Guard and New Order, eerily foreshadow the time we currently find ourselves in. For just like France after 1940, we are now living in one of those times. And what we do now will be looked back at by future generations as, to quote Paxton again, a grave moral case. This is particularly true of historians whose knowledge of the past should, one would expect, come with both a critical ability to know better and the drive to harness the past into moral positionings and actions. So what I want to reflect on in this talk is how it feels to be a historian here and now at this particular point in time. What is the responsibility of the historian, and more broadly of humanities scholars, during times of climate collapse, televised genocide, techno-feudal fascism, and imperial meltdown? How does it feel to be working, as is the case with me, on the dystopian nature of wildly trusted civilizational myths when these same myths are being repurposed for yet more dystopian enterprises in real time? And what is the moral duty of historians in times like now? I'm a historian who works on antiquity, as Abbes said, more specifically on ancient Egyptian history and on the Roman world. And I also work on the colonial entailments of antiquity fields, on the contemporary resonances of ancient history. And I've worked on topics that bring together ancient history, modern imperialism, the Anthropocene, fascism, and Orientalism. As a historian of empire who has researched and taught history in the longue durée, like Abbes, I like to say that I'm an expert at deciphering power, and I'm sure this is the same with many of you today. Now, this expertise is a blessing, but it also, quite honestly, sometimes feels like a curse, because I, like I'm sure several of you, am able to connect dots and identify historical patterns in ways that evade most people. In a context of late-stage capitalism, where the humanities are often deemed unworthy, even by university administrators who tend to fawn over whatever new shiny thing corporations and donors are into, at least in North America, this leads me to often feel like a Cassandra. History is not a line, and neither is it a circle. It is not a predictive science. French historian Paul Venn famously wrote that history is a narrative made of true events. To me, it is a discipline that unearths and weaves and tells true stories about places and peoples of the past in ways that allow us to better understand what the present is made of, and by the same token, what futurities are possible. History takes you on a spiraling ride in the most humbling and existential sense of the word. I also agree with what French medieval historian, World War I and II veteran, founder of the Annales School, and later member of the Résistance, Marc Bloch, wrote in his posthumous book, The Strange Defeat, about the moral duty of the historian. This extraordinary book, which is written like a testimony, aims to lay out how and why the French people capitulated to the Nazis. In the opening section, Bloch, who was born into a secular Jewish family in 1886, expands on how his work as a historian has led him to both, and I quote, look at many documents in order to sort the true from the false, and watch and observe a lot. For I always thought that the first duty of a historian, as my master Pirenne used to say, is to be interested in life. The particular attention I dedicated in my work to rural matters finished to convince me that without looking into the present, it is impossible to understand the past. Good eyes to contemplate fields are no less indispensable to the rural historians than some skills in deciphering old grimoires. These are the same critical, observatory, and I hope honesty-driven skills I try to apply to the study of the tragic events of which I have become a very modest actor. In his will, which he wrote in Clermont-Ferrand in 1941, Bloch states, "I consider complacency towards lying, no matter what pretext it comes with, as the soul's worst leprosy." He then wishes for his tombstone to be inscribed with these simple words, "Dilexit veritatem," he cherished the truth. Arrested in Lyon by the Klaus Barbie-led Gestapo on March 8, 1944, and tortured several times at the city's infamous Montluc prison, where he was detained, Bloch was executed on June 16th of the same year, together with 29 other members of the Resistance. I foresaw what we are in the midst of now globally in my first year at the University of Toronto. So that was the year 2008-2009, which is, as I'm sure you remember, the year of the global crash. In addition to taking stock of what the immediate implications of the USA-driven global financial crash were, I was overtaken by an ominous feeling. I thought of 1929, and I thought of what followed 1929, including, obviously, the rise of fascism in Europe and worldwide, and World War II. That ominous feeling stayed with me ever since, and as of late, it's only grown. When the genocide in Gaza started, I thought of the ongoing genocide in the Americas, where I live and where my ancestors moved from Western France in the 1660s. I thought of the myth of Terra Nullius, of Julius Caesar's conquest of the Gauls, which many scholars consider now to be a genocide, and a century earlier, of the obliteration of the thriving cities of Carthage and Corinth by the Roman army. I also thought of the American Civil War and of the Vietnam War, and I thought of the disintegration of the American empire, which, as we are seeing it unfold in real time, is extraordinarily reminiscent not only of the demise of European hegemony, but also in its political manifestations and myth-making narratives of the late Roman Republic and early Principate. The illegal decapitation of Venezuela's presidency by the American army in January of this year made me think of Mark Antony's capture in 34 BC of the king of Armenia, Artavasdes II, following his siding with the Parthians, an empire whose core is today's Iran. According to Roman historian Tacitus, Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII paraded Artavasdes and his family in golden chains during their Alexandrian triumph. Ordered to prostrate himself in front of Cleopatra, the king refused. Three years later, after the couple's defeat at Actium, Cleopatra had him beheaded. The anti-ICE movement in Minnesota and more broadly in the USA, including the general strikes that took place this winter, made me think of the secessio plebis. The secession of the plebs, for those who don't know, was a series of 5 general strikes staged by the Roman plebs between the 5th and 3rd century BC against the aristocratic or patrician monopoly of and abuse of power. During these strikes, the plebs gathered on the Aventine Hill. These strikes worked. Finally, on January 20th of this year, in a speech to Davos, he wrote himself, Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, quoted a famous aphorism written by 5th century BC Greek historian and general Thucydides in a recreated dialogue known as the Melian dialogue. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. The deeper historical potency of this quote in the context of the current moment led me to co-write with my colleague Matthew Sears a op-ed that was published in the Globe and Mail, which is one of Canada's, let's say, national newspapers. All of this to say that as someone who spends most of my days shifting between the past, the present, and the future, my mind is constantly connecting dots that straddle long periods of time and faraway places. These connections are important and they bear meaning. Right now, what they point to is an ever-expanding dystopia that we are all entangled in. Today's dystopia does not limit itself to international news. I feel it all around me in the urban fabric of capitalistic and mass-surveilled Toronto. I have to reckon with daily as the employee of a corporatized institution which increasingly devalues the humanities to the benefit of whatever golden calf donors are into. So right now, it's AI. And I feel it, obviously, in the increasingly mild winters we have in Canada. We are not scholars, students, and teachers in a vacuum. While I do believe that history is a science that requires thorough training and methodological rigor, I also know that history making is simultaneously a creative process. By this, I mean that I consider my work to be impacted by my positioning, and in reverse, my work impacts me. So this is how I approach my job as a historian. At the moment, my work focuses on the relationship between classics archaeology and the British colonization of Toronto and Alexandria. Over the past year, in the context of a fellowship at the University of Toronto's Humanities Institute, my experience working on this project has been unfolding together with my processing of the ever-unfolding dystopian present. To me, the two are connected. Since colonization is about the land, then archaeology is about extracting stories about the past from the land. The intellectual product that is the classics has played a pivotal role in the legitimization of European empires through the fantasy of their civilizing mission, and it continues to be instrumental to the American imperial project, which is also predicated upon Orwellian notions of civilizations, and I include in this the West and American ideas of freedom. Alexandria and Toronto are two cities whose histories have been marketed as civilizational fairy tales, whereby through foreign colonization, land that was supposedly, until then, if not empty, then in an uncivilized, unproductive state, became a blossoming cosmopolitan lighthouse. In both cases, classical antiquities and classicizing aesthetics played a key role in legitimizing and reproducing this story. Yet, I argue that the Eurocentric notion of civilization is dystopia. It is dystopia because it's a tool of colonial erasure. It was already used by Napoleon Bonaparte, obviously, when he invaded Egypt in 1798, and we see it now being repurposed by the Americans as justification for pretty much all of their invasions and military campaigns. We also see it within the US, currently being used by the Trump regime as a rationale for the ICE neo-Nazi machine. So what does it mean to be a historian in increasingly dystopian times? This is a hard question, but to help us, let's say, nourish the conversation, I will share two stories with the uplifting title of Dystopia and Defeat. So let's start with the first one. As As shown by Veselin Budakov, the word dystopia is attested for the first time in the English language in a classics-inspired poem entitled Utopia, or Apollo's Golden Days. It was published anonymously in 1747, but is generally attributed to Lewis Henry Young, an Anglican settler based in Dublin, whose grandfather probably came from Kent in England. Utopia celebrates Philip Dormer Stanhope, Earl of Chesterfield, who was the Viceroy of Ireland for a total duration of 8 months in 1745-1746. 5 years before Chesterfield's mandate, Ireland suffered a horrendous famine, commonly known as the Year of the Slaughter. Coupled with epidemics of typhus, smallpox, and dysentery, the frost-driven famine is thought to have killed up to 450,000 of the 2.5 million inhabitants of the island at the time. In the 18th century, the indigenous Irish people had been suffering for half a millennium, a brutal, oppressive occupation by the British. What we could argue amounts to a system of apartheid that favored Protestant settlers. At the time, Ireland was officially categorized as a client state of the British Crown. But half a century later, in 1800, it was fully annexed into the United Kingdom. According to Young, Lord Chesterfield was worth a poetic celebration because of his ability to keep, through his benevolent style, Ireland in a state of peaceful submission. So let's read a part of the poem. But heaven of late was all distraction, and more than ever rent and faction, caused only by the wretched isle on which we thought no God would smile. Not storied with wealth or blessed in air, no useful plants would ripen there. Mismanaged by the unskillful hands, or nipped by chilling Easter winds. Or if they flourished for a day, they soon became some insect's prey. For many such infest the soil, devouring the honest laborer's toil. So venomous that some had rather have in their stead the toad or adder. Unhappy isle, scarce known to fame, dystopia was its slighted name. In an excerpt from the poem published in Gentleman's Magazine, September 1748 issue, a footnote defines dystopia as an unhappy country, and this is something else that Budakov discusses in his article. The poem then goes on to celebrate how Chesterfield, who Young assimilates to the Greek god Apollo, transformed the dystopia that was Ireland into a utopia, which is defined as a happy or blessed country in another footnote. Dystopia owned that shaking throne and made our royal cause our own. We, therefore, mindful of our zeal for yours and for your monarch's will, send bright Apollo for a while to cheer that loyal drooping isle. If gratitude appears on earth, to heaven the goddess owed her birth. Then let her not be wholly driven to grosser earth from purer heaven. Such bliss we never gave before. We ought no less, we could no more. Thrice happy isle, the boast of fame, henceforth Utopia be thy name. To Young, Ireland was a dystopian and unhappy island in the past because it was ruled by despotic rulers in ways that fostered misery, famine, and unrest. By contrast, Apollonian luminous Chesterfield brought happiness to the island because of his benevolent style. While Young's assessment of Chesterfield's ruling style is confirmed by other sources, we must keep in mind that his point of view is tied to his positioning as a member of Ireland's Protestant settler elite. Young's utopia is predicated on a well-oiled, seamless, and profitable occupation of Irish land and on the oppression of the indigenous population to the benefit of the local settler elite and of the British Crown. In contrast to this civilizational narrative, his dystopia is presented as an unmoored, plagued wilderness, one that threatens the very core of the settler colonial project in Ireland in ways that trigger a spectrum of more openly visible forms of violence, from famine to social unrest to civil war. That the first known use of the word dystopia in English stems out of a poem that celebrates a viceroy of Ireland is striking to me. It is striking because it highlights the pernicious nature of colonialism. While the indigenous Irish population might have preferred Chesterfield's style to its predecessors, the reality of their social, economic, and political oppression, and more broadly, their inability to be sovereign on their land, remained. As my colleague Audrey Dipte said in a talk she gave in Toronto earlier this year, someone's utopia is always someone else's dystopia. The assimilation of Lord Chesterfield's with Apollo reminds me of another more famous colonizer who also liked to be portrayed as the Greek god, and whose imperial journey included a stopover in Egypt. I am talking about Napoleon Bonaparte. One of my favorite teaching images of all time is this one, the frontispice page of the Description de l'Égypte, which you have a copy of upstairs. This image proposes a colonial utopia that is not dissimilar to Young's poem in the sense that it also implies that with an Apollo-like ruler, Egypt's classicizing civilized happiness was coming back. So the Apollo at the top is actually Napoleon Bonaparte, in case you haven't recognized him, on a four-horse chariot, which is actually a representation of the four-horse chariot that is on top of the Basilica San Marco in Venice. He's followed by the Muses, and he's coming back to Egypt, chasing away the Mamluks with the imperial eagle, and this is a personification of the Nile. Of the Nile. This is a statue, common representation of the Nile. Okay, so the idea with this image is that, Napoleon is bringing back civilization, happiness, the muses, knowledge, etc. But was it really the case? Maybe not. What happened, for sure, is that the British kicked out the French pretty quickly, as you all know. In fact, they were out before the publication of the Description de l'Égypte. And a long period of British occupation, and after the bombing of Alexandria in 1882, of colonization followed. While Nasser, in turn, kicked out the British in 1956, the country became, especially starting from Sadat, increasingly integrated into the hegemonic sphere of the American empire in following decades. Just like Ireland, and just like everywhere else in the British Empire, the classicizing utopia, which the French, then British colonizer, used to justify their occupation of Egypt, covers up a dystopian, extractive underbelly that is articulated along racial and class lines. One would assume these dots would be easily connected by all my colleagues, including in North America, but alas, that is not the case. And that leads me to my second story. A few years ago, French colleagues invited me to give a talk at a conference they were organizing. The theme of the conference was Classical Antiquity and Post-Colonialism. I gladly accepted, and I proposed to speak about doing classics on indigenous land. The organizers enthusiastically also accepted my suggestions, so I gave my talk, there was much interest, and then I was invited to participate in the edited volume. Fast fast forward to late 2023. I was turning my talk into a paper entitled, and I'm going to translate here, From Kanata to Dunya, Teaching and Studying Antiquity, Classical Antiquity on Indigenous Land. So, given the circumstances, I deemed it was essential to add an epilogue to my paper entitled From Turtle Island to Palestine. So Turtle Island is a name given by many indigenous peoples to North America, and it's also been a very common slogan put forward firstly by indigenous folks in the context of the genocide in Gaza. Now, as this subtitle says, my epilogue focuses on what indigenous peoples have been saying about the structural similarities between the genocides in North America and in Palestine. As such, this section centers indigenous scholars and activists. Fast forward to the summer of 2024. The editors asked to meet with me over Zoom to discuss my epilogue. During the conversation, I told them that given the topic and the time that had passed on since my first draft and everything that had happened, it had really become something dishonest for me to think about taking it off and not addressing Palestine. So I also committed to updating my piece and to adding more scholarly references to take into account the unfolding of events, which I did. Fall 2025, the anonymous referee's report came in. The French-speaking referee only had 2 comments on my 30-plus page paper. So the first comment was my use of the term genocide and génocidaire as it pertains to what Israel has been doing in Gaza since October 2023 is questionable because according to the referee, this is a debatable diagnostic to this day. And likewise, the second comment was that the referee had issues with me writing that Israel is a settler colony. So I added many references that further backed up what I wrote. These include Francesca Albanese's writings and reports, reports by numerous international organizations, like there are dozens of them, I'm not gonna list them here, and also work by experts like Omer Bartov and Ras Siegel, and work by many Palestine studies and settler colonial studies scholars, including Nadia Abu el-Hajj, Nahla Abdo, Muhannad Ayash, Noor Masaha, Jeremy Wilderman, Patrick Wolf, and Ilan Pape. I also address how negationism of the type many Zionists are pushing forward corresponds to the last of Gregory Stanton's 10 stages of genocide. And I noted how this movement is not without echoing the revisionism decried by French ancient historian Pierre Vidal-Naquet in his 1981 book, Les Assassins de la Mémoire. Last but not least, I also cited Marc Bloch's The Strange Defeat, as well as Didier Fassin's 2024 book, Une étrange défaite, so A Strange Defeat. The English title is different, but you understand the French title is a direct reference to Bloch's book. So here's a short passage from that epilogue. At a time when it is trendy in British settler colonies to start official events with a land acknowledgement. So a land acknowledgement is a practice in many settler colonies where we start by saying we are on the indigenous land of this and this people. It's become a bit a debate, but I'm not going to expand on this. So going back to my quote, at a time when this is trendy, the complicit silence of the vast majority of tenured colleagues, including antiquity scholars, on the genocide and epistemicide in Palestine, is a stark reminder of the limit of what Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard calls the politics of recognition in his book, Red Skin, White Mask. So Dene is an indigenous people, and obviously the title of his book is a reference to Fanon. It is all the more so unfortunate that just like classical studies were and remain instrumental to settler colonial projects in North America, so is Zionism rooted to a great extent in a truncated and historically inaccurate appropriation of the ancient history of the Levant. The refusal of almost all European and North American classicists to harness their expertise in a way that can help, if not prevent, then at least fight against the genocide of the Palestinians and the annihilation of their heritage, is a brutal reminder of the ongoing Orientalist nature of this discipline. Here is, to paraphrase Marc Bloch and Didier Fassin, a strange moral defeat. Shortly after I emailed them my final revised manuscript, the editors sent me the last pre-approved version of my paper. Well, it turns out there was a new issue. When I write that Zionism relies to a great extent on a truncated and historically inaccurate weaponization of the ancient history of the Levant, could I write that this is according to some historians? The implication of this request, as I understand it, is that since Zionists won't admit to the very well-documented fallacy of the ethno-fascist weaponization of history, it is my evidence-based assessment and that of all my expert colleagues that must be presented as an opinion. And I put here pictures on Everyday Orientalism. We actually have a whole primer on ancient and medieval Palestine that also debunks several Zionist myths that weaponize history. And each of them is written by one of the experts here, and it comes with also a selected bibliography. So if you're interested to learn more, this is a great place to start. The editors also shared with me what they wrote about Palestine and my work in their introduction to the volume. So among other things, and I'm going to paraphrase here, pro-Palestine narratives run the risk of reproducing anti-Semitic tropes. Patrick Wolf's work, including his seminal piece on settler colonialism and the elimination of the native, in which he argues that settler colonialism is a structure and not an event, stems from contestable proofs and arguments. It is therefore a shame, argue the editors, that French scholars have not engaged with it yet. Accordingly, my epilogue is set to reflect a radical position, which comes with the risk of weakening the quality of my overall work. However, they, the editors, decided to include my contribution anyways, in order to offer readers a sense of the full field of controversies. In sharp contrast with this critique of Patrick Wolf and of my work, nowhere in the section of their introduction that they shared with me do they mention, let alone engage with, the indigenous and Palestinian scholars that I center in my epilogue. Instead, their focus is exclusively on the supposedly radical and controversial work of two white settler historians, Patrick Wolf and myself. So a reminder that this volume is on classical antiquity and post-colonialism. Now, I'm very aware that it is risky for French academics to publicly speak up against Israel's genocide of the Palestinians right now. As you all know, academic events have been canceled, there's been violent suppression of student advocacy, and more broadly, decolonial scholarship remains frowned upon in many fields, including antiquity fields. In that regard, Fassin's book is an exception rather than the rule. I'm also aware that the editors are responsible for a whole volume with many other authors. So I suspect they were anxious that given the political climate, which is very volatile in France, my epilogue might jeopardize the whole project and create troubles for them. Yet I cannot reconcile with the contradiction whereby, while I was left completely free to write about the responsibility of classicists in the face of the genocide enacted in North America, I was met with considerable anxiety, if not gaslighting, when I extended the same reflection to Palestine. As I've said earlier, I'm a 12th generation settler on Turtle Island. I've also lived and studied many years in France, and I continue to visit and collaborate with colleagues on a regular basis. So I'm very aware of the country's past and ongoing coloniality, which I've witnessed on many occasions. Yet I had somewhat naively, I now realize, underestimated the length to which French society and its political elite would go to suppress and discredit those who publicly opposed the genocide in Palestine. I've come to understand that this response is perfectly coherent with France's history of anti-Semitism, colonialism, and fascism. Indeed, as Paxton's work has masterfully showed, a large number of French folks either overtly or covertly collaborated with the Nazis during the occupation. These include Roman historian Jérôme Carcopino, who worked for the Vichy government and whose support of Marc Bloch in the context of the anti-Jewish laws was a rare exception to his otherwise rather zealous Pétainism. France's response to the genocide in Gaza has taught me that while the country's elite loves to celebrate their resistance to Nazi occupation, including the fact that France sent a lesser proportion of the country's Jewish community to death camps compared to other countries, so that percentage is 25, the truth is that France is similar to Germany when it comes to its institutional complicity and inability to properly process its collective guilt. It took, for instance, until 1995 for the government to recognize Vichy France's responsibility in the persecution and genocide of France's Jews, and the Vichy archives, for all sorts of reasons, were only declassified in 2015. I should also say that Paxton's book was not translated in French for a long time. Gallimard refused at the time to publish it. Instead of being properly reckoned with, this inconvenient truth has been avoided through a perverted process whereby France's guilt has been projected onto the Palestinians and absolved through an embrace of the Zionist project. On February 12 of this year, Ilan Pape highlighted to the Danish parliament how this phenomenon can also be applied to many other European countries. In fine, France's complicity with Israel's apartheid and genocide in Palestine is coherent with what the country, to a large extent, remains: a colonial metropolis that is morally compromised. Fanon and Césaire wrote it best. The way my French colleagues handled my chapter's epilogue is symptomatic of the moral failure of most North American and European scholars working in antiquity fields, including my fellow ancient historians. It is in line with the selective rage of many American colleagues who remain remarkably mute on Palestine, but all of a sudden have a lot of things to say publicly about ICE and Trump. It is in line with the depraved attempts of the American Historical Association and the European Association of Archaeologists Executive to veto democratic votes in favor of BDS and PACB. It is in line with the American School of Oriental Research's erasure of Palestinian heritage and long-standing and ongoing platforming and funding of scholars and projects affiliated with complicit Israeli institutions. And it is in line with university chairs caving in to Zionist bullies by clamping down on critical scholarship and events. I've made the decision that I am not willing to work with editors who discredit my critical scholarship because they felt compelled, for whatever reason, to enact what we call in English the Palestine exception. This type of censorship, with scholars working full-time on Palestine, and especially Palestinians, have to deal with incessantly, is one of the reasons why 10 years ago, Rachel Mayer's Oussama Ali Gad and I created the platform Everyday Orientalism. So I pulled out of the volume, and now my chapter is floating around. I might send it to a Brazilian journal. I've been advised to not even try with any other French journal, but if anyone has an idea, you're welcome to let me know. Let me now conclude. On June 23rd of this year, Marc Bloch will be inducted into the French Panthéon, together with his wife and research partner, Simone Vidal. President Macron celebrated, and I quote, his scathing lucidity, which strikes us still today, as well as his audacity with words and ideas that doubled with physical courage. What would Bloch think of Macron's, and more broadly of Europe's, feeble resistance, if not capitulation, to Trumpian fascism and spiraling expansionism? What would he think of the silences, cowardice, and intellectual myopia of so many historians in the global north in the face of Israel's epistemicide, scholasticide, and genocide in Palestine? We will never know. What we do know, however, is that in the strange defeat, Bloch warned us about the tragic moral failings awaiting the historians who, in the face of dystopian forces, choose to abandon the critical and moral duties that come with their craft for the sake of their own comfort and convenience. And I will end with Bloch's words. Since we were not prophets, we had not guessed about Nazism, but we were foreseeing well enough that, under a shape we were unable to draw with precision the contours of, the German outburst would one day come, fed by grudges whose follies were multiplying the seeds and whose outbreak would be terrible. We knew all of this, and yet, lazily, cowardly, we let it be. We feared the crowd's shock, our friends' sarcasms, the inexplicable spite of our mentors. We did not dare to be, in public, the voice who screams, first in the desert, but at least, no matter what the final outcome is, can always console themselves for having belied their faith. We prefer to confine ourselves to the fearful quietness of our workshops. May our juniors forgive us for the blood that is on our hands. With these cheerful words, I say thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and can start some, if you have some remarks or questions, we have time.
Thank you, Catherine, for this lecture. What for the future?
I don't know.
What for the future?
Hopefully, maybe my title was misleading and everyone was hoping for an answer. I don't know. I cannot be optimistic. I'm very existential right now, and I'm trying to do what I can. I don't know. It's not looking great. It's looking like it's going to get worse before it gets better. But you tell me what you think.
All the periods from Alexandria until now, so when we try to analyze this, I think we will continue, unfortunately. So maybe je suis un peu not optimist, pessimist.
Pessimiste, oui.
Thank you, merci. Another question? Yes, miss. You can speak in English only. No, in Arabic I think no. I'm not no, in English only.
If you want to speak, Abbas, are you comfortable to translate for me? Yeah?
Translate, yes, if you want.
Oui, peu importe.
محمد سالم مؤرخ. أنا كنت بتساءل على الدور بالنسبة للعواصم التي تم تدميرها في الوقت الحالي زي بغداد، زي دمشق، زي بيروت، زي صنعاء، ودور المافياكرات اللي موجودة في طهران. وبالنسبة للمستقبل، العواصم اللي ممكن يتم تدميرها زي العواصم اللي تم تدميرها زي القاهرة زي باريس زي برشلونة، وده بتدخل من المافياكرات اللي موجودة في طهران. فهل ده ممكن يحصل ولا؟
It's impossible to. Vas-y, mais c'est الجزء
اسفه انا ما بتكلمش عربي كويس، اسفه.
محمد سالم مؤرخ. أنا كنت بستفسر عن العواصم اللي تم تدميرها زي بيروت زي بغداد زي صنعاء زي دمشق، تمام؟ وعلاقة حكومة المافياكرات اللي موجودة في طهران في تدمير هذه العواصم. حكومة المافياكرات اللي موجودة في طهران وتدخل.
Voilà. Bon. Another question, please. T'as vu comme je fais rapidement, hein. T'as vu comme c'est l'autorité, ça. Another question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. So the historian has a moral duty. What are the shapes? How can this moral duty be performed? Because we are not sure that writing articles, writing books is actually what can be heard. How can the historian's voice be made to be heard?
Thank you. The way I've been approaching my responsibility, and obviously I'm not, in English we say virtue signaling, like I'm not saying I'm better than everyone else. I'm doing my best, but I'm fallible as well. I've been trying to, I feel like we have a responsibility of being a counterweight to political power and fascism and fallacies and the weaponization of history, because we have the critical tools and expertise to, put the facts forward. So I've been trying to make interventions or to embed these discussions in my research, in my public-facing scholarships. So on Everyday Orientalism, we've been putting out a lot of accessible but very high-quality posts, including the EU-Palestine primer. I'm trying to embed these discussions also in my teaching. I think that teaching, I'm also, I have a position where I teach. I think this is where I am the most useful, in the passing on of knowledge to the students. And I do believe that we kind of model what intellectual integrity is to our students, right? Indigenous folks in North America have this idea that we should strive to be good ancestors. So I'm trying as best as I can to be a good ancestor by doing this. Now, also, we have to be kind of smart about it, right? So depending on the context, the way you can do your moral duty can vary, right? So now in Canada, I'm quite sheltered. I have a permanent position. I'm white. We're not in a situation like in Germany or the United States yet. So I'm taking the space in that way. But moving forward, it might become too dangerous. As a colleague said, you would not go to the Nazis in Paris in 1944 and say F you to their face. Like, that would be kind of suicidal and pointless. So we have to be smart about it. Yeah, I don't know if this is helpful or not.
Question, another. Dr. Am Khairi.
Catherine, thank you very much for your really inspiring talk. I couldn't help thinking about historians in the global south.
Yes.
and how the situation can be, might look different. I just wanted to share my ideas with you
Yes, please.
and see if something maybe might come out of it. So what I have been thinking about is that while you have been talking about the responsibility of the historian and how historians need to speak truth to power, on the other hand, in situations like in Egypt and other countries,
Yeah.
where you cannot be very critical on contemporary issues, sometimes history as a discipline protects you. But then what happens when you go into history, when you learn to be a historian, you find ways to connect the past to the present. And then you think about, is this all? Should I stay stuck in history? What is the point of, and I'm sorry to bring
No,
this
no, go
example,
ahead.
what is the point of writing and researching and looking at classical times, Egypt in the times of Romans, for example,
Yeah.
while we see things like ecocide and genocide happening in Gaza? I'm not sure where I'm going with my thoughts, but I just wanted to share it with
Thank
you.
you.
History from the viewpoint of the global south.
Thank you.
What is different?
Yeah, obviously I'm talking from my perspective and everyone's positioning is different, which is why I think it's important to acknowledge that and acknowledge that our work is not just confined to our workshops, as Bloch says. That being said, spaces like today, I think, are very important as well. These spaces for discussions are becoming rarer and rarer. We are hosting, actually, in Toronto, I'm co-organizing an event, I won't be there, tomorrow, on sports and Palestine. And just to give you an example, one of the members of the organizing team realized that it was advertised on social media and through departmental lists, and the form was hacked by Zionist bots, so overnight they got 35,000 bot RSVPs, right? So in some ways, my experience has been that it's been easier to talk about these topics here in Egypt. I also gave a talk about a year and a half ago at AUC on doing history in times of genocide. And it was fine, I gave it. There was no issue. In Toronto, it might be much more tricky, actually, yeah.
So it's more difficult in terms.
I think so, yes, yes.
Thank you. Yes, Frédéric?
I'm talking a lot. I'm sorry. I have a second question, which is more of an epistemological kind of question. I wanted to come back to Marc Bloch's position that actually Marc Bloch obviously was kind of playing on words. He was departing from the usual, the cliche that you cannot understand the present if you do not know the past. And he said, no, actually it's the other way around. You cannot understand the past if you do not think about the present. Okay. So for a historian, isn't there a danger here of projecting today's values on past events, or actually is that not a danger? And should we indeed see the past through our present-day values? Is it something that we should avoid, or is there something to gain for the historian in using present-day values and our present-day system of ethics on times that ignore totally those ethics?
Thank you. This is a very important question.
An impressive question.
Yes, the way I see it, so I've come to understand at this point when I teach ancient history courses, the first thing I do is to make sure I start by having the student think about the history of the discipline and where it's coming from and how have we come to develop this field and to study things the way we do, right? And to me, this is now essential, and sometimes I compare it to doing therapy. It's about self-awareness and self-critique, right? So this Enlightenment idea of complete rationality and objectivity is in itself a subjective kind of fiction, right? There's no such a thing as a human who is not subjective. We're embodied, emotive bodies, right? So to me, as a historian, I need first to be aware of myself, of the place I'm in, of what have I inherited in terms of historiographical topoi and ways of looking at the sources, because all of these are kind of filters, right? So when you do a therapy, you come to understand why you do the things you do, and there are some patterns, and where are they coming from? And if you want to get beyond that, you need to be aware and deconstruct these patterns. So I feel that as historians, this is what we should do. So I agree with Bloch in that way. I'm not sure he would have explained it the same way as me, but I think this is an essential condition to doing justice to the ancient stories that we have the privilege of accessing and telling.
Last question.
I think the contribution you offer in connecting it with... Oh, no, it's okay. I don't know how to speak in the mic. To connecting the dot between the Palestinian genocide and the genocide in the Americas is very helpful, especially for a European public for which a genocide is connected more to the Holocaust.
Yes.
This is very valuable, and I think as historians, I'm not a historian, but as historian, we need your help. You're told that you're being censored. I don't know if we're in France 1940. I don't know if it's too late. You're being censored in some paper, but you can express yourself on a website and etc. So I guess there is one way out here.
Yes, yes, for sure. So there's a version of the paper which will be published in English. So it's in the process of going through the, I think I'm post-referring, they changed venue, but it's going to be a Routledge volume. Now this is a francophone version, which makes it harder to find a home. Yeah, I think more than me, I think there are a lot of indigenous and Palestinian scholars in North America and the diaspora, but also in Palestine, who are doing very important work and connecting these dots. So I'm fortunate that I live in Toronto because there's a huge Palestinian diaspora, and there's a very strong indigenous presence in the city. And these people have been coming together, for way before actually let's say what I call the second Nakba, right? So I think these people really should be centered more, which is why I really accepted to contribute to this particular conference, because I thought there might be an interest from my colleagues, obviously in Quebec, but also in the European Francophone world and diaspora. So yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to play victim, by the way. I shared this story because I think it's a good starting point for a broader discussion. I could just have said yes, added according to some historians, but listen, you can judge me. My moral compass was telling me this is not good. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming here.